My name is Dylan Hughes. For 25 years, I've walked through the scorching sun of Arkansas fields, endured freezing nights in an old barn, and carried emotional wounds that time could never fully heal. Today, as I sit here at Hilltop Ranch, the farm my grandparents left behind, I want to tell my story. Not to boast or complain, but to preserve the memories, the fragments that have shaped who I am today. And perhaps to understand why I'm still standing, despite everything that once tried to pull me down. I was born in a small corner of Arkansas, where endless cornfields stretched to the horizon and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and red earth. Hilltop Ranch, my grandparents' farm, was my entire world. It was where I grew up, where I learned to wield a hoe, plant seeds, and listen to the quiet hum of the land. But my childhood wasn't just about running through fields or listening to my grandfather's tales of past harvests. It was also marked by cracks, painful silences that I could never forget. My mother, Monica, was a gentle woman with a smile as warm as the morning sun. She would sing old country folk songs while working in the kitchen, her soft voice drifting through the windows, mingling with the breeze over the fields. I still remember those afternoons sitting by her side, listening as she talked about plant varieties, how to choose the best seeds, or how to care for the cattle to keep them healthy. She told me that the land has a soul, and if you love it, it will give back tenfold. I was just a kid, but those words etched themselves into my mind like an unspoken promise to this very land. But then when I was 10, everything fell apart. My mother passed away after a sudden illness. I still remember that fateful day when the sky was gray as if the whole world was mourning. My father, Paul Hughes, stood by her bedside holding her hand, his eyes empty. He didn't cry, didn't say a word, just stood there like a statue. I, on the other hand, screamed, clung to my mother, begging her not to go. But she only gave a faint smile, brushed my hair, and whispered, "Take care of your grandparents, Dylan, and never abandon this land." Those were her last words. After my mother's death, my father changed. He became distant, cold, as if a part of him had died with her. He was no longer the father who carried me on his shoulders, taught me how to tie my shoes, or laughed with us around the dinner table. Instead, he started staying away from home, leaving me alone in an empty house. I didn't understand why, only that each time he returned, he reeked of alcohol, and his eyes held no warmth for me. Then one day when I was 11, my father called me out to the yard, looked at me with tired eyes, and said, "Dylan, you're going to live with your grandparents. I can't take care of you anymore." That was it. No explanation, no comfort. I stood there stunned, clutching the old backpack my mother had sewn for me as he turned and walked away. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because I was too shocked, too hurt to cry. The day I arrived at Hilltop Ranch, it felt like stepping into a dream. The farm sat on a gentle hill, surrounded by sprawling fields of corn and alfalfa. My grandparents' wooden house stood proudly among ancient oak trees, with a porch adorned with wildflowers and an old swing that creaked in the wind. My grandfather, Russell, with his white hair and kind smile, enveloped me in a warm hug the moment I stepped off my father's old truck. My grandmother, Virginia, with her bright eyes and gentle voice, took my hand and led me inside, where the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air. "This is your home, Dylan," she said, "and we are your family." The years I spent with my grandparents were the most beautiful of my childhood. Grandpa Russell taught me everything about the land. He said farming wasn't just planting seeds and waiting. It was about understanding the soil, the crops, and even the rain and heat. He took me to the fields, showed me how to recognize good soil, how to care for corn so the kernels would be plump, and how to know when the cattle needed extra hay. He told me stories of past harvests, of drought years when the family stayed up all night watering the fields, and of joyful harvest days when the whole village came to help. Through those stories, I felt his love for Hilltop Ranch, not just as land, but as a legacy, a soul. Grandma Virginia taught me other things. She taught me patience, how to listen, and how to find joy in the simple things. Every afternoon, she'd sit in her armchair knitting, telling me stories about my mother, about the days they worked together in the garden. "Your mother loved this land, Dylan," she said. "And now, you're the one to carry it on." Those words made me feel a responsibility, not just to my grandparents, but to my mother, who had passed on her love for the land before she left. But not every day was filled with joy. Some nights I lay in bed staring at the wooden ceiling, thinking about my father. He rarely visited, and when he did, he'd only stay for a few hours, asking vague questions before leaving again. I remember once asking him, "Dad, why don't you stay here with me?" He just shook his head, sighed, and said, "You'll understand when you're older." But I didn't understand, and the feeling of abandonment grew inside me like a sharp thorn piercing my heart. Even so, Hilltop Ranch was my refuge. Every morning I woke to the rooster's crow, ran to the barn with Grandpa, or helped Grandma pick vegetables in the garden. I learned to ride horses from Grandpa, to fix fences, to predict the weather by reading the clouds. In the summers, we'd sit under the big oak tree, sipping Grandma's lemonade, watching the sun set over the fields. "This land is yours, Dylan," Grandpa said, "but it's only worth something if you love and protect it." I nodded, though I didn't fully grasp the weight of his words back then. Those years gave me not only the love of family, but also a burning passion for farming. I started reading books about agriculture, watching shows about farming techniques on my grandparents' old TV. I dreamed of one day bringing what I learned back to Hilltop Ranch, turning it into a modern farm where technology and tradition could coexist. I didn't know then that the path wouldn't be easy, and the greatest challenges wouldn't come from the land, but from my own family. When I was 15, I began to realize that Hilltop Ranch was more than a home. It was what kept me grounded through loss. But I also sensed a storm coming, though I couldn't yet see its shape. My father, who had abandoned me, would eventually return, bringing troubles I couldn't foresee. And when that time came, I'd face difficult choices between family, loyalty, and the promise I made to this land. But that's a story for later years. For now, as I recount those days, I still feel the warmth of my grandparents, the smell of dry grass in the fields, and my mother's voice echoing from the past. Those are the things that shaped me, the foundation for moving forward no matter how many obstacles lie ahead. Hilltop Ranch is more than just land. It's home, it's memory, it's a promise I'll keep until the end of my days. The years spent living with my grandparents instilled in me a fierce love for the land, for the seasons of harvest, and for the peaceful days I knew would never return. But it was during those days that I began to realize I didn't just want to preserve the farm, I wanted to take it further, to transform it into something my grandparents would be proud of. That's when I understood that to achieve this, I needed to learn, to gain knowledge, and to practice the patience Grandpa Russell had taught me. When I was 16, I started spending more time in the small room at the corner of the house, where my grandparents kept a shelf full of old books. These were books on agriculture, livestock techniques, and farming magazines Grandpa Russell had collected over the years. I devoured them page by page, even though some of the terminology went over my head. I remember nights sitting under the glow of an oil lamp, jotting down ideas about improving soil or machinery that could make fieldwork easier. Grandma Virginia would watch me, smile, and say, "You're just like your grandpa when he was young, always dreaming but full of determination." Her words fueled my motivation and resolve, but I wasn't always confident. Some days I wondered if I was strong enough to take on Hilltop Ranch. The farm was vast, with hundreds of acres, a herd of cattle, and crops that depended on unpredictable weather. I was just a kid who had never left Arkansas, never faced the world beyond. In those moments, Grandpa Russell would sit beside me, place a hand on my shoulder, and say, "You don't need to know everything right now, but if you love this land, it will show you the way." And so I kept going, step by step, learning from him, from Grandma, and from the fields themselves. By the time I was 17, I started exploring modern agriculture. One day, I stumbled upon a show on my grandparents' old TV about farms in California using greenhouses and drip irrigation to boost productivity. I was captivated. The idea of bringing technology to Hilltop Ranch, blending my grandparents' traditions with new advancements, kept me awake with excitement. I began borrowing books from the school library and searching the internet, something I was only just learning to use on the school's clunky computer. I read about moisture sensors, automated irrigation systems, and using data to predict crop yields. Each idea was like a small spark, igniting my dreams. In my final year of high school, I threw myself into studying. I wasn't the top student, but I was determined. I spent hours reviewing math, science, and writing essays about my dreams. My grandparents were always there, supporting me. Grandma Virginia helped me study, editing every sentence of my essays, even though she said she wasn't as good at it as my mother had been. Grandpa Russell quietly saved money, selling extra corn and milk to cover my future tuition. "You focus on learning, Dylan," he said. "Leave the rest to us." The day I received my acceptance letter from Purdue University for agricultural engineering, I shouted with joy in the middle of the field, then ran home to hug my grandparents. Grandma Virginia cried and Grandpa Russell just smiled, though I saw his eyes well up. "You did it, Dylan," he said. "Now go and bring back the best for this land." I nodded, but a fear crept into my heart. Purdue was a whole new world, hundreds of miles from Arkansas. I was afraid I wouldn't keep up, that I'd disappoint my grandparents. Most of all, I was afraid to leave Hilltop Ranch, the place that had given me everything. On the day I left for Purdue, my grandparents saw me off at the bus station. Grandma Virginia pressed a box of homemade cookies into my hands while Grandpa Russell slipped an old notebook into my bag, filled with his handwritten notes about the land. "Take this with you," he said. "Don't forget your roots." I hugged them, trying to hold back tears, but as the bus pulled away, I cried like a child. I wasn't crying out of fear, but because I knew I was carrying the hopes of my grandparents, my mother, and the very land of Hilltop Ranch. My first days at Purdue were a shock. I had never felt so small, surrounded by vast lecture halls, professors who spoke at lightning speed, and classmates from all over the world. But I refused to back down. I studied day and night, took meticulous notes, and enrolled in every course related to high-tech agriculture. I was fascinated by lectures on smart irrigation systems, sensors for monitoring crop health, and renewable energy for farming. Each time I learned something new, I imagined applying it to Hilltop Ranch, turning its cornfields into model farms. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. Some nights I stayed up worrying about tuition, whether my grandparents were doing okay, and about my father, who had all but vanished from my life. He called only a few times a year, his voice cold, asking perfunctory questions before hanging up. I didn't know how he was living, but each time I heard his voice, the distance between us grew. I tried not to dwell on it, focusing on my studies, but deep down I still hoped one day he'd return and look at me with some pride. At Purdue, I also found new friends who shared my passion for agriculture. They came from farms in Iowa, Nebraska, or even big cities, but loved the land. We worked on projects together, debated ways to improve farming techniques, and dreamed of a future where agriculture wasn't just a job, but a way to change the world. Those days gave me confidence that I wasn't alone, that my dreams were achievable. During college, I started making concrete plans for Hilltop Ranch. I sketched preliminary designs for greenhouses, calculated costs for drip irrigation systems, and researched soil sensors. I sent these ideas to my grandparents, and each time I received a letter back from Grandma Virginia, my heart warmed. She wrote, "You're doing big things, Dylan. We believe in you." Those words were my greatest motivation, the fire that carried me through exhausting days at school. But I never expected that just a few months later, that fire within me would face a raging storm when Grandpa Russell, the person I loved most, left me forever. I remember that day clearly, a freezing winter afternoon at Purdue. I was in the lab, engrossed in a model irrigation system, when my phone rang. Grandma Virginia's voice on the other end trembled, so faint I had to strain to hear her. "Dylan, your grandpa, he had a heart attack and he didn't make it." Those words hit me like a blow, and it felt as if the ground beneath me collapsed. I stood frozen, gripping the phone, unable to speak. Grandpa Russell, the man as sturdy as an oak who taught me how to hold a hoe, how to listen to the land, was gone. I wanted to scream, to run back to Hilltop Ranch, but all I could do was slump to the floor, tears streaming uncontrollably. I took a week's leave from school to return to Arkansas. The bus ride home felt endless, each mile bringing back memories of Grandpa. I remembered the mornings he took me to the barn, the way he laughed heartily when I clumsily spilled a bucket of milk, his warm, steady voice telling stories of past harvests. He wasn't just my grandfather, he was my teacher, my father, my entire world. When the bus stopped in front of Hilltop Ranch, I saw Grandma Virginia standing on the porch, her eyes red but forcing a smile. I ran to her and we stood there, embracing in the cold wind, crying in silence. Grandpa's funeral was held at the farm, simple but warm, just as he had lived. Neighbors and friends from nearby farms came to pay their respects. They shared stories of Grandpa Russell, the generous man always ready to lend a hand, always proud of Hilltop Ranch. I stood by his coffin, looking at his serene face as if he were merely sleeping, and vowed to carry on his legacy no matter the cost. A few days after the funeral, Grandma Virginia called me into the living room where she kept important documents in an old wooden box. "Dylan," she said, her voice serious but filled with love, "your grandpa left something for you." She handed me a thick envelope containing Grandpa Russell's will. My hands trembled as I opened it and read the words written in his firm, clear handwriting. All of Hilltop Ranch, the cornfields, the cattle, the wooden house, and the modest savings in the bank was left to me. Not my father, not anyone else, but me, Dylan Hughes, a 19-year-old grandson. I was stunned. "Grandma, why me?" I asked, my voice breaking. She took my hand and looked me in the eyes. "Because your grandpa believed in you. He knew you loved this land, knew you'd protect it. Your father, he chose a different path." I understood what she meant. My father, Paul Hughes, had abandoned the farm long ago, abandoned me. But I never imagined Grandpa would place such immense trust in me. Alongside the pride, an invisible weight settled on my shoulders. Hilltop Ranch was now my responsibility, and I had to prove I was worthy. But the news of the will didn't just shock me, it ignited a fire of anger in my father. He showed up at the farm a few days later while Grandma Virginia and I were cleaning the barn. He stepped out of his old truck, his face gaunt, eyes bloodshot. Whether from alcohol or rage, I wasn't sure. "The will?" he roared, throwing a copy of the document to the ground. "Why this kid? I'm his son." My heart pounded and I didn't know how to respond. Grandma Virginia stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp as steel. "Paul, you abandoned this land. You abandoned Dylan. Your father knew that." My father glared at me, his eyes burning with resentment, as if I had stolen something that belonged to him. You little punk," he pointed at me. "You think you're better than me? You think you can keep this farm?" I wanted to reply, to say I didn't want to take anything, that I only wanted to protect Grandpa and Grandma's legacy, but the words caught in my throat. I stood there, silent, as he turned and stormed off, leaving behind a heavy air like a storm brewing on the horizon. From that day, my father cut off all contact. I didn't know where he went or what he did, only hearing vague rumors from neighbors that he was living in a small town, doing odd jobs and often drunk. I tried not to think about it, but every time I recalled his hateful glare, an old wound in my heart throbbed. I wondered why he had changed so much. Why couldn't he love me the way my grandparents did? Grandma Virginia became my only anchor in those days. She helped me complete the legal paperwork to officially become the owner of Hilltop Ranch. At 19, I was far too young to shoulder such a large responsibility, but she was there, guiding me every step of the way. "You don't have to do everything alone," she said. "But you have to be strong because there will be people who want to take what you have." Her words were a warning, and I didn't know how soon they would prove true. Meanwhile, I continued my studies at Purdue with renewed determination. Hilltop Ranch was now mine, not just on paper, but in my heart. Every lesson, every project, I thought about how to apply it to the farm. I worked harder, not just for good grades, but to live up to Grandpa Russell's faith in me. Yet I also began to feel the pressure. Sleepless nights in the dorm had me questioning whether I was strong enough to protect Hilltop Ranch, to make my dreams for it a reality. Grandma Virginia still wrote to me telling me about the farm, the cattle, the harvests. But I noticed her letters grew weaker, as if she were hiding her exhaustion. I called home more often, visited during every break, but each time I saw her, she seemed older. Her hands trembled as she held the hoe, her eyes sometimes distant, as if remembering Grandpa Russell. I knew she was pushing herself for me, but I also knew time was taking away the last family I had. And then, like a cold wind sweeping through the fields, my father returned. Not alone, but with a young woman, my future stepmother, and her young daughter. They arrived at Hilltop Ranch like a storm, bringing troubles I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know then that my father's return would open a new chapter, one filled with pain and challenges, where I would have to fight not only to protect the farm but to hold on to who I was. That day I was at Purdue preparing for midterms when Grandma Virginia called. Her voice trembled, not from exhaustion but from something that immediately set me on edge. "Dylan," she said, "your father's back. He brought a woman and a little girl with him. They want to stay at the farm." I gripped the phone tightly, feeling as if a stone had lodged in my chest. My father, who had all but vanished from my life, who had glared at me with resentment over Grandpa Russell's will, was back, and with a new family. I didn't know how to feel, angry, confused, or just plain hurt. I took a few days off from school to return to Arkansas. The long bus ride gave me time to try to imagine what awaited me. I'd heard bits and pieces about my father from neighbors. He'd been doing odd jobs, drifting and often drunk. But a new wife, a stepdaughter. It felt like a betrayal, even though I no longer held any expectations of him. Hilltop Ranch was my home, my grandparents' home, my mother's memory. How could I let strangers waltz in as if they belonged? When I arrived at Hilltop Ranch, the scene before me left me stunned. My father stood in the yard next to a young woman, maybe only a few years older than me, with dyed blonde hair and bright red lipstick. The girl beside her, about 12, with her hair in a ponytail, was engrossed in her phone, not bothering to look up at me. Grandma Virginia stood on the porch, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes filled with worry. I walked over and hugged her, trying to hide the anger rising inside me. "Dylan," my father said, his voice dry. "This is Pamela, my new wife, and this is Scarlett, her daughter." Pamela flashed an awkward smile and extended her hand. I shook it, but inside I wanted to scream that they didn't belong here. Scarlett didn't even glance at me, muttering something under her breath before returning to her phone. I looked to Grandma Virginia, hoping she'd say something, but she just shook her head slightly, as if urging me to stay calm. "We want to stay here for a while," my father continued, avoiding my eyes. I lost my job. We need a place to start over." My blood boiled. Start over? After all the years he'd abandoned me, abandoned the farm, now he wanted to come back like nothing had happened. I wanted to protest, to say that Hilltop Ranch was mine, Grandpa Russell's legacy, not a temporary shelter for him and his new family. But Grandma Virginia placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. "Dylan, let them stay for now. Your father's still family. We can't turn them away." I looked at her, my heart constricting. Grandma Virginia always believed in family, always hoped my father would change, despite how many times he'd let her down. I didn't want to make her sad. Didn't want to cause her more pain, so I clenched my jaw and nodded. "Fine," I said, my voice cold, "but only temporarily." My father smirked, as if my feelings didn't matter, then turned to Pamela, telling her to bring their things inside. The days that followed were a nightmare. Pamela quickly showed her true colors. She treated Hilltop Ranch like her own, rearranging things in the kitchen, criticizing Grandma Virginia's cooking, and even ordering her around like a servant. "Old lady, make me some coffee, will you?" Pamela would say in a saccharine tone laced with condescension, lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Grandma Virginia, with the patience of a saint, would smile and comply. But I could see the sadness in her eyes, as if she were swallowing her pain. Scarlett, Pamela's daughter, was no better. She was messy, leaving things strewn around the house and speaking rudely to Grandma Virginia. Once I saw her toss a pair of muddy shoes onto the kitchen table, right where Grandma was kneading dough. "Scarlett, put your shoes away," Grandma said gently. Scarlett rolled her eyes and snapped, "Why are you so annoying?" "Just leave them." My blood boiled and I wanted to slap her, but Grandma grabbed my hand and shook her head. "Don't, Dylan," she whispered. "They won't stay long." But I wasn't so sure. My father, Pamela, and Scarlett showed no signs of leaving. They took over the largest room in the house, the one my grandparents used to sleep in. I had to move my things to a corner of the living room, sleeping on the sofa because there was nowhere else. Each night, hearing their laughter from the other room, I felt like an outsider in my own home. Hilltop Ranch, once my sanctuary, had become a silent battlefield where I fought to hold on to peace. I tried talking to my father, hoping he'd understand. One afternoon, as he sat in the yard smoking, I approached, keeping my voice calm. "Dad, I don't want trouble, but this is my home, Grandpa and Grandma's home. Pamela and Scarlett, they don't respect Grandma, they don't respect this place." He looked at me, his eyes cold. "Who do you think you are, lecturing me?" he snapped. "You're just a kid who got this farm because the old man didn't trust me. Now you want to kick me out?" His words cut like a knife, slicing deep into my heart. I wasn't a thief, but he looked at me as if I'd stolen everything from him. After that conversation, my father only grew more defensive of Pamela and Scarlett. Whenever I spoke up about how they treated Grandma Virginia, he brushed it off or scolded me for being an ungrateful son. Pamela became bolder, interfering with the farm's management, criticizing how Grandma cared for the cattle, and even suggesting we sell part of the land to make some money. I was livid. Sell the land? Sell Grandpa Russell's legacy, my mother's legacy? I looked to Grandma Virginia, hoping she'd object, but she stayed silent, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. I began to feel helpless. I was at Purdue most of the time, only coming home during breaks, and each visit made Hilltop Ranch feel more foreign. Pamela and Scarlett acted like they owned the place, while Grandma Virginia, the strong woman who had been my rock, was fading. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't want to hurt her or shatter her fragile hope of mending our family. Those months, Hilltop Ranch was no longer my sanctuary. Each time I returned from Purdue, the air in the wooden house felt heavy. Pamela had turned the place into her domain. She changed everything, from the arrangement of kitchen utensils to dipping into the farm's savings to buy luxuries. A new TV, expensive clothes, and even a used car she bragged about around the village. Scarlett grew increasingly disrespectful, not only to Grandma Virginia but to me as well. She littered the yard, spilled food on the floor, and smirked whenever Grandma gently corrected her. I wanted to scream, to drive them out, but every time I saw Grandma's weary eyes, I clenched my jaw and endured. Grandma Virginia, though growing weaker, still tried to keep the peace. She woke early to tend to the cattle, weeded the garden despite her trembling hands and unsteady steps. I noticed her thinning frame, her silver hair growing sparser, her eyes often drifting as if searching for Grandpa Russell in the corners of the house. One day I found her sitting alone in her armchair, clutching an old photo frame of Grandpa, tears silently streaming down her face. "Grandma, please rest," I said, trying to hide the ache in my heart. She only smiled and ruffled my hair as she did when I was a child. "I'm fine, Dylan. I just miss your grandpa." But she wasn't fine. I knew it, and I blamed myself for not doing more to protect her. I was at Purdue most of the time, only home for a few weeks each year, and each visit showed her fading, like a candle burning down to its last flicker. I tried to spend time with her, helping in the fields, fixing fences, or just listening to her stories. But Pamela and Scarlett always found ways to intrude, ruining those moments. Pamela treated Grandma like a servant, ordering her to cook, clean, or pick up after Scarlett's messes. "Virginia, you're so slow," Pamela once said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Let me handle it, you rest." But her handling meant lounging on the couch while Grandma did everything. My father, as usual, did nothing to stop it. He seemed to have fully sided with Pamela, defending her in every situation. Once I overheard him yelling at Grandma when she accidentally spilled a cup of coffee Pamela had demanded. "Mom, you're old. Everything you do is sluggish." I stood there, stunned, unable to believe my father could speak to his own mother that way. I wanted to rush in to tell him to stop, but Grandma grabbed my hand and shook her head. "Don't, Dylan," she whispered. "Let it go." But it didn't go away. Things only got worse. One summer afternoon, just after I returned from Purdue, I found Grandma Virginia collapsed in the garden, clutching her chest, gasping for breath. Panic surged through me as I ran to her, shouting for help. Pamela and Scarlett were inside, but neither bothered to come out. My father sauntered over, looking at Grandma with indifference. "She's old, probably just tired," he said, as if it were no big deal. I rushed her to the hospital, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, praying she'd be okay. The doctor said she was exhausted, with high blood pressure and a weakening heart from too much stress. I knew where that stress came from: Pamela, Scarlett, and the son she still hoped would change. Grandma stayed in the hospital for a few days, and I never left her side. When she woke, she smiled at me, but her smile was so frail it made my heart ache. "Dylan," she whispered, "promise me you'll protect Hilltop Ranch. Don't let anyone take it away." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I promise, Grandma," I said, my voice choked. "I won't let anyone hurt this place." She returned home, but her health never fully recovered. Pamela and Scarlett acted as if nothing had happened. Pamela even said to me, her voice laced with mockery, "She's so weak, Dylan. You should get a professional caretaker. You're busy with school, you don't have time." I glared at her, anger flaring inside me, but I held back because I knew Grandma didn't want me to fight. I just wanted her to have peace, even if only for her final days. But that peace never came. One autumn night while I was at Purdue, I got a call from a neighbor. "Dylan, come home now." His voice trembled. "Virginia, she's gone." It felt like the world collapsed. I frantically packed my things, caught the earliest bus to Arkansas, but the entire journey I could only think of her. The woman who loved me unconditionally, who taught me how to live, how to love the land. When I arrived, she was already in her coffin, her face serene, as if she had found Grandpa Russell somewhere far away. Grandma Virginia's funeral was quiet, attended only by a few neighbors. My father, Pamela, and Scarlett were there, but I saw no grief on their faces. Pamela even whispered to Scarlett, giggling about something as if it were just another gathering. I stood by Grandma's coffin, holding her cold hand, consumed by guilt. I had promised to protect her, but I had failed. I let her endure disrespect and injustice in her own home. That pain, mixed with regret, cut into my heart like a knife. After the funeral, I returned to Purdue to finish my final year of college. The pain of losing Grandma Virginia lingered, a constant ache in my heart, but I channeled it into motivation. I studied with an almost obsessive focus, taking meticulous notes on high-tech agriculture, from drip irrigation systems to soil sensors and smart greenhouses. I knew that protecting Hilltop Ranch required more than knowledge. It demanded action. I reached out to professors, joined research projects, and even took a part-time job at a nearby farm to gain hands-on experience. Every night in my small dorm room, I opened Grandpa Russell's notebook, rereading his words about the land, and told myself, I can do this. For him, for Grandma, for Mom. After graduating from Purdue with a degree in agricultural engineering, I didn't rush back to Hilltop Ranch. I knew that to realize my dreams, I needed practical experience and some capital. I landed a job at an agricultural company in Indiana, specializing in designing smart irrigation systems. The work wasn't easy. Long hours from dawn to dusk, dealing with demanding clients and complex projects. But I learned how to manage time, work with a team, and most importantly, apply technology to farming effectively. I saved every penny, sending some money back to maintain the farm and staying in touch with Mr. John, a kind neighbor who agreed to look after the cattle and fields while I was away. 2 years later, I decided to return to Hilltop Ranch. I was ready to start anew, to turn my ideas into reality. But when I stepped foot on the farm, I realized everything had changed. My father, Pamela, and Scarlett had completely taken over the main house. They didn't just push me out of the living room, they relegated me to the barn as the only place I was allowed to stay. "You can stay there, Dylan," Pamela said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "The main house is for the baby that's coming." I was stunned to learn Pamela was pregnant with a boy, and they had already prepared a room for the child as if Hilltop Ranch belonged to them. The barn where I once played with Grandpa Russell became my home. It was cold, filled with the smell of hay and old wood, furnished with a fold-out cot and a few crates of old belongings. But I didn't let it break me. I looked around the barn, saw Grandpa's old tools and sacks of seeds, and thought, this is where I'll start. I cleaned it up, turning it into a workspace. I brought in an old table, a worn-out laptop, and began drafting plans. Building a small greenhouse, installing drip irrigation, and testing soil sensors on a corner of the field. I worked day and night, managing the farm while pushing my projects forward. I woke before sunrise to check the cattle, fix fences, then returned to the barn to research. I contacted friends from Purdue for technical advice and even took out a small bank loan to buy equipment. Every step was hard, but I never forgot Grandma Virginia's words. Protect Hilltop Ranch, Dylan. I wanted to turn the farm into a model of innovation, where technology and tradition merged, honoring my grandparents' legacy. Living with my father, Pamela, and Scarlett, however, was a bigger challenge than I expected. Pamela grew increasingly overbearing, using the farm's bank account for her shopping sprees, while Scarlett was messy and disrespectful. She often sabotaged my work. Once I caught her flooding my experimental irrigation system just for fun. I struggled to contain my anger, reminding myself to focus on the bigger goal. But seeing how they treated Hilltop Ranch, like a resource to exploit, not a place to cherish, made my heart ache. My father, as usual, didn't care. He spent most of his time in town drinking or doing odd jobs. Whenever I tried to talk to him about the farm or my projects, he brushed me off. "You think you're better than me?" he once sneered. "This farm's going nowhere, Dylan." His words cut like a knife, but I refused to let them bring me down. I thought of Mom, of my grandparents, and told myself I wasn't doing this for him, but for myself and those who believed in me. Slowly, my projects began to bear fruit. The drip irrigation system I installed in a corner of the field worked well, saving water and boosting crop yields. The small greenhouse I built in the barn, though modest, produced its first harvest, clean, vibrant, organic vegetables. I invited Mr. John and a few neighbors to see, and their astonished looks filled me with pride. "You've done it, Dylan," Mr. John said, clapping my shoulder. "Russell would be proud." Those words fueled me, helping me push through exhausting days. But not everyone supported me. Pamela started noticing my work. She'd barge into the barn, eyeing my equipment suspiciously, then make snide remarks. "Why waste money on this stuff? No one needs high-tech farming in this backwater." I ignored her, but a growing unease settled in me. I realized Pamela didn't just want control of the house, she wanted control of Hilltop Ranch, and my father, though he didn't say it outright, seemed to side with her. One evening, as I was reviewing data from the soil sensors, Scarlett sauntered into the barn holding a cup of soda. She looked around, smirked, and deliberately spilled the drink on my desk, soaking my laptop and notebook. "Oops, sorry," she said, her voice devoid of remorse. I shot to my feet, anger surging, but I held back, saying only, "Get out, Scarlett." She shrugged and left, leaving me with soggy papers and a sense of helplessness. I began to wonder how long I could keep going when the people in my own home treated me like an enemy. But I didn't know that those troubles were just the surface. A bigger, darker secret was brewing in the main house, where my father, Pamela, and Scarlett lived. And when that secret came to light, it would shake Hilltop Ranch to its core, thrusting me into a battle I couldn't avoid. One evening, while I was checking data from the soil sensors in the barn, I overheard a conversation through an open window. It was Pamela, speaking on the phone in a low but clear voice. "Rick, I told you everything's going according to plan," she said, her tone brimming with confidence. "Paul's easy to handle, and that kid Dylan, he won't be able to do anything." I froze, my heart pounding. Rick? Who was this man? And why was Pamela talking about me like that? I recalled how she always emphasized that the baby she was carrying was my father's, that their family would soon grow. But the intimate tone she used with this Rick sent a cold suspicion creeping into my heart. Was the baby really my father's? I started paying closer attention. Pamela frequently took calls at night when my father was drunk and fast asleep. She kept her voice low, but once I overheard her mention Rick in a familiar, almost affectionate way, as if they shared a secret relationship. Scarlett, though Pamela's daughter from a previous relationship and unrelated to my father, seemed to know something too. She was always texting, giggling, and sometimes sneaking out to meet someone at the farm's gate. I had no proof, but the pieces were adding up and I couldn't ignore them. I began to wonder, was Pamela deceiving my father? And if so, was the baby she called Paul's son truly his? I kept my suspicions to myself, not sharing them with anyone. I didn't want to hurt my father despite the pain he'd caused me over the years. But I also couldn't let Pamela continue manipulating Hilltop Ranch, the place that held all my memories of my grandparents and mother. I decided to bide my time, observe more closely, and search for evidence. But I didn't expect that the opportunity to uncover the truth would come sooner than I thought, bringing with it a storm far bigger than I could have imagined. The storm hit one spring morning when I uncovered a horrifying secret. My father and Pamela were plotting to sell Hilltop Ranch, the land my grandparents and mother had devoted their lives to preserving. I was checking the irrigation system in the field when I got a call from Mr. John, the kind neighbor who helped look after the farm. "Dylan, come home now," he said, his voice thick with worry. "There's a real estate agent at the house talking about selling the farm. Your father and Pamela are meeting with him." I raced back, my heart pounding, my blood boiling. When I stepped into the main house, I saw my father, Pamela, and a stranger sitting around the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of them. Pamela was laughing, her voice syrupy as if she were negotiating a bargain, while my father sat silently, his face tense, hands clasped tightly. Scarlett stood in the corner scrolling on her phone, but her eyes flicked toward me as if she knew I'd cause a scene. I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to stay calm, but the anger inside me was a fire ready to erupt. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice icy, cutting through the silent room. Pamela looked up, her smile unwavering, but I caught a flash of panic in her eyes. "Oh, Dylan, you're back? We're just discussing the farm's future," she said, her tone as sweet as sugar but dripping with falsehood. I didn't respond, stepping to the table and glancing at the papers. My heart stopped when I saw a real estate sales contract with Hilltop Ranch printed boldly at the top. I turned to my father, my voice trembling with rage. "Dad, what is this? Are you trying to sell the farm?" My father avoided my gaze, his lips moving as if to speak, but he only mumbled, "We need the money, Dylan. This farm, it's just a burden." A burden? It felt like a knife to the chest. Hilltop Ranch was Grandpa Russell's legacy, Grandma Virginia's home, the place where my mother sang folk songs, where I'd poured sweat and tears into building my dreams. And now my father, who never set foot in the fields, never tended a single cornstalk, dared to call it a burden. I flipped through the papers and one detail made me go cold. My signature, clumsily forged on a power of attorney document. The scrawled handwriting wasn't mine, but there it was, a blatant betrayal. Gripping the paper, my hands shaking, I glared at Pamela. "Who forged my signature?" I demanded, each word sharp as a bullet. "Who dared to do this?" Pamela shrugged, her smile still plastered on, but I saw her hands clench under the table. "Calm down, Dylan," she said. We just wanted to keep things legal." "Legal?" I shouted, unable to hold back. "You forged my signature, tried to sell Hilltop Ranch, my property, and you call that legal? Do you think I'm that stupid?" I turned to my father, hoping he'd speak up, say he didn't agree with this. But he just hung his head silent, as if he'd already surrendered to Pamela. My heart shattered, but my anger overpowered the pain. "If you and she don't stop this right now, I'll take you to court," I growled, locking eyes with my father. "I swear I won't let you steal Hilltop Ranch." At that moment, Scarlett, who had been quiet in the corner, suddenly spoke up. "Who do you think you are, threatening us?" she yelled, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a kid obsessed with this rundown farm. Your grandparents were idiots for leaving everything to you instead of my mom." Her words poured fuel on my rage. I spun around, blood rushing to my head. "How dare you talk about my grandparents like that?" I roared. "They spent their lives building this place while your mother only knows how to destroy it." Scarlett smirked, stepping closer, and continued, "Your grandparents were nothing. Just two old farmers who thought this pile of dirt was worth more than gold." I couldn't take it anymore. My anger exploded, breaking every boundary. I raised my hand and slapped Scarlett, not hard, but enough to make her step back, clutching her cheek, eyes wide with shock. The room fell into a deadly silence. Pamela screamed, rushing to Scarlett's side, while my father leapt to his feet, his face red with fury. "You dared hit her?" he bellowed, and before I could react, he swung his hand, striking me so hard I staggered. Pain seared across my face, but what hurt more was his gaze, not sorrow, but blind defense of Pamela and Scarlett. I stood tall, touching my stinging cheek, the burn radiating. But I didn't cry, didn't back down. I looked at my father, then Pamela, and finally Scarlett, who was nestled in her mother's arms, pretending to sob. My anger turned into a sharp, cold resolve. "You want to protect them?" I said, my voice low but steady. "Are you sure that baby in Pamela's belly is yours? Are you sure she's not cheating on you like she's trying to cheat me out of Hilltop Ranch?" I paused, staring straight into Pamela's eyes. "I've heard her talking to a guy named Rick every night. She speaks to him like he's the one who matters. What do you think about that, Dad?" The room went deathly still. Pamela's face paled, her lips moving but no words coming out. Scarlett looked up, eyes wide, as if terrified by what I'd said. My father stood there, his face ashen, his gaze flickering between me and Pamela. "Dylan, what are you saying?" he asked, his voice breaking as if my words hit harder than the slap he'd given me. Pamela tried to regain her composure, shouting, "You're slandering me! You're crazy, Dylan!" But her voice trembled and her eyes avoided my father's. I said nothing more. I turned and walked out of the main house, my heart heavy. I didn't want to hurt my father, despite all the pain he'd caused me. But I couldn't let Pamela keep manipulating, couldn't let Hilltop Ranch, the legacy of my grandparents, my mother, fall into the hands of deceivers. I knew things would never be the same from here on. The real storm had begun, and I had to prepare for what was coming. After that confrontation, the atmosphere in the main house became more oppressive than ever. Pamela and Scarlett avoided me, but I could feel their prying eyes whenever I moved between the barn and the house. My father grew quiet, but I noticed a change in him. He wasn't drinking as much, instead spending long hours sitting alone in the yard, staring at the fields with vacant eyes. I wanted to say something, to ask if he believed what I'd said about Pamela, but each time I saw his haggard face, I hesitated. I knew he was wrestling with himself, and all I could do was wait. A week later, my father disappeared from Hilltop Ranch. He didn't tell anyone, leaving only a scribbled note on the kitchen table. "I'll be gone a few days. Don't look for me." Pamela shrugged when she saw it, as if she didn't care, but I caught a flicker of worry in her eyes, as if her secret was at risk. I didn't ask questions, quietly continuing my work in the barn, checking the irrigation system, tending the greenhouse, and planning the farm's expansion. But deep down, I knew my father was searching for the truth, and I feared what he'd find. 3 days later, he returned, I was in the field checking the soil sensors when I heard his truck pull up in the yard. I ran back, my heart pounding, and saw him step out, his face pale, eyes red as if he'd been crying. He didn't look at me, didn't speak, just walked straight into the main house. I followed, a wave of unease rising within me. When I stepped inside, I saw him standing face to face with Pamela, clutching a stack of papers, his voice trembling with rage. "Pamela," he said, each word sharp as a blade, "you lied to me, the baby. It's not mine." The room seemed to explode. Pamela jumped up, her face ashen, trying to deny it. "Paul, what are you talking about? You're crazy," she screamed, but her voice faltered, lacking its usual confidence. Scarlett, sitting on the couch, dropped her phone, her eyes wide with panic. I stood in the doorway, my heart racing, but I wasn't surprised. My suspicions had been confirmed, yet watching this unfold, I felt no triumph. Only a deep, aching pain. My father slammed the papers onto the table, his voice shaking with anger and hurt. "I got a DNA test, Pamela. I met Rick, the man you've been calling every night. He admitted everything. He's Scarlett's father and the baby in your belly. It's his too." I stood frozen, though I'd suspected as much. My father had investigated, faced the truth he didn't want to believe. Pamela backed away, clutching her stomach, scrambling for excuses. "Paul, you've got it all wrong. I didn't..." But she couldn't continue, pinned by the burning intensity of his gaze. Then Pamela's demeanor shifted. She straightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "Fine, Paul, you want to talk about deception?" she shouted. "You lied to me too. You said Hilltop Ranch was yours, that me and my kids would have a good life here. But you're nothing but a failure, living off your own son." Her words were a dagger, stabbing not just my father, but me too. I wanted to scream, to tell her to shut up, but I stood still, waiting to see what my father would do. He staggered, as if struck by a physical blow. He looked at Pamela, then Scarlett, and finally at me. "I trusted you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought we were a family." But Pamela dropped her facade. She smirked, her voice dripping with contempt. "Family? You're nothing to me, Paul. I stayed here for this farm thinking it would be ours. But now it's over." She turned to Scarlett, barking, "Pack your things, we're leaving." That night, Pamela and Scarlett left Hilltop Ranch. A black pickup truck pulled up to the gate and a man stepped out. I assumed it was Rick, Scarlett's father and the father of the unborn child. Pamela didn't look back, dragging Scarlett into the truck, leaving my father standing in the yard, his face like that of a broken man. I watched from the barn door as the truck vanished into the darkness, a mix of relief and pain washing over me. Pamela and Scarlett were gone, but the cost was my father's complete devastation. In the days that followed, my father was a shadow of himself. He didn't drink, didn't argue, just sat on the porch staring at the fields with empty eyes. I tried talking to him, but he only shook his head, saying, "Dylan, I was wrong. I've lost everything." I wanted to comfort him, to say he still had me, still had Hilltop Ranch, but the words stuck in my throat. He had chosen Pamela, defended her, struck me to protect a family that wasn't his. And now, with the truth laid bare, he was left with nothing but loneliness. After Pamela and Scarlett left, Hilltop Ranch returned to a quiet stillness, but it was a strange kind of silence. Gone were Pamela's false laughter and Scarlett's shrill chatter. But so too were the lively mornings when Grandpa Russell took me to the barn, or the peaceful afternoons when Grandma Virginia made lemonade. The main house now felt empty, like a hollow seashell, occupied only by my father, a man worn down by time and his own mistakes. I retreated to the barn, my fortress, and threw myself into work. The greenhouse needed expansion, the soil sensors required calibration, and the cattle demanded care. I had no time to dwell in grief, for Hilltop Ranch was a promise I couldn't break. One evening, as I was reviewing data from the irrigation system, my father appeared at the barn door. He stood there silently, hands in his pockets, his gaunt face illuminated by the dim light. "Dylan," he said, his voice hoarse, "I want to talk." I paused, looking at him, waiting. He stepped inside, sat on an old chair, and sighed. "I was wrong," he said, staring at the floor. "I abandoned you, the farm, your mother, and your grandparents. I thought Pamela would give me a new family, but I was wrong." His words cut like a knife, both painful and tear-inducing. I wanted to say something, to tell him I'd forgiven him, but I couldn't. Too many wounds had accumulated and I didn't know how to erase them. "I want to stay here, Dylan," he continued, his voice trembling. "I have nowhere else to go. Give me a chance to make things right." I looked at him, my heart torn. Part of me wanted to reach out, to give him the chance to mend things, to be the father I'd once hoped for. But another part, the part that had endured his abandonment, his contempt, his slap in anger, couldn't forget. I stood, meeting his gaze, and said, my voice cold but firm, "You chose your path. This is the consequence." He looked at me, his eyes red, but said nothing more. He stood and walked out of the barn, his figure small under the moonlight. A few days later, my father moved out. He rented a small apartment in a nearby town, living alone, no longer contacting me. Mr. John told me he worked odd jobs at an auto shop, living quietly, no longer drinking but devoid of vitality. I didn't know how to feel, heartbroken, relieved, or just empty. But I knew that whether he stayed or left, Hilltop Ranch was my responsibility, and I wouldn't let anyone, even him, shake my resolve. I dove into work with renewed energy. I expanded the greenhouse, installed more soil sensors across the fields, and began experimenting with new crop varieties. I reached out to experts from Purdue, inviting them to visit Hilltop Ranch, and received invaluable advice. Slowly, the farm transformed. Clean produce from the greenhouse sold in town, bringing steady income. The cattle thrived thanks to the health monitoring system I implemented. I even partnered with a local university, turning Hilltop Ranch into an experimental model for high-tech agriculture. Neighbors who once doubted my fancy machines now looked at me with admiration. "You've done it, Dylan," Mr. John said, clapping my shoulder. "Your grandparents would be so proud." Each day I worked from dawn to dusk, but I didn't feel tired. Every drop of sweat, every late night spent analyzing data was part of the promise I kept. Hilltop Ranch wasn't just a farm, it was the soul of my mother, Grandpa Russell, and Grandma Virginia. It was where I found myself, where I learned to rise after loss. Some nights in the barn, I opened Grandpa Russell's notebook, rereading his words. "The land is only worth something if you nurture it and protect it from the greedy." His words were a guiding light, reminding me I'd chosen the right path. One autumn afternoon, as the sun bathed the cornfields in gold, I stood in the middle of the farm, gazing at the lush rows of crops, the gleaming greenhouses under the sunlight. The distant lowing of cattle mixed with the hum of the irrigation system. I closed my eyes, feeling the breeze carry the scent of dry grass and red earth, as if my mother, Grandpa, and Grandma were somewhere out there, smiling at me. I thought of my father, his mistakes, the loneliness he now endured. I didn't know if I'd ever forgive him, but I knew I wouldn't let that pain define me. Hilltop Ranch was now a testament to what I'd achieved. It wasn't just a farm. It was a story of resilience, love for the land, and promises kept. I stood there in the fields and whispered to myself, "I did it, Grandpa, Grandma, Mom. I kept my promise." And as the sunset fell, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, I would keep protecting Hilltop Ranch, not just for the past, but for the future.